Hello, everyone. My name is Natalie Turvey. I'm President and Executive Director of the Canadian Journalism Foundation, and it is my great pleasure to welcome you to today's J-Talks Live webcast, Reimagining Business Journalism. Thank you for joining us for these important conversations exploring the future of journalism. This is our final J-Talks Live program of the season. You can find videos and podcasts of all of our past talks on the CJF website, and we look forward to being back with you in September with a new lineup of conversations featuring news thought leaders on pressing issues in journalism. We're grateful for the generosity of our exclusive J-Talk series sponsor, TD Bank Group, for making this season of conversations possible. And our thanks also to our important in-kind supporters, CPAC and Cision. If you would like to support the work of the CJF, you can donate now or at any time on the CJF website. And a reminder to save the date for the CJF annual award ceremony on June 7th, where we will be celebrating Canadian journalistic excellence and highlighting emerging talent. We're thrilled to announce that Margaret Atwood will be joining us to provide opening remarks at this year's CJF Awards. For ticket information and details on our live stream, you can visit the CJF Awards website. Today's program is an hour long, and you can still submit questions for our speakers at any time using the tab on your screen. And if you'd like to tweet about today's conversation, our hashtag is JTalksLive. And now on to our program. The world of work has been profoundly affected by the COVID-19 pandemic. Housing affordability, precarious work, social isolation, labor inequity, and the drive to automation are just some of the challenges facing the modern employee. So how can our newsrooms rethink their business coverage to reflect the post-COVID economy and ensure they stay relevant among their readers? Today, we are joined by a panel of thought leaders in business journalism who will share their insights on the future of industry coverage. Joining us from the New York Times, please welcome finance editor Anupreeta Das. From Global News, senior digital broadcast journalist Anne Gaviola, and from the Globe and Mail, senior business writer and columnist Rita Trichur. They're in conversation with Toronto Star business reporter and longtime journalist on the business beat, Christine Dobby. It is an honor to have this stellar panel with us today on our virtual stage. Christine, over to you.
Thanks so much, Natalie. It's really great to be here with everybody virtually, as always. But I'm really thrilled to have a conversation with these women about business journalism. We had a prep call for this panel, and we discovered that we will have no shortage of topics to cover during this conversation. But I'd love to start with a question for you all about audience and how each of you sees the audience for the work that your media organization does. So like, who are your readers or your viewers, and how are you trying to reach them? And has that changed at all over the past 2 years with the events of the pandemic, which have really highlighted a lot of social inequities, as well as the business world and the broader world's reckoning with racism and colonialism? So I know that's a big topic, but really, who are you trying to reach, and how are you trying to reach them? Preeta, I thought we could start with you. How do you see the audience for the New York Times finance coverage?
Yeah, I think our readership is, we're writing for the intelligent, smart, well-informed, but general reader. So it's not a financially sophisticated audience necessarily, but it's someone who wants to know what's going on in the world of finance and business. And if they're going to read 1 or 2 or 3 stories about a particular topic, you want that the story you're writing incorporates all of that information. So you necessarily have to do much more in-depth piece of reporting and writing, a story that is much more analytical and comprehensive, that really addresses all of the topics and ties together all of the different threads that, someone who's following the news because of work might be kind of like going and reading every twist and turn, but our readers necessarily aren't going to do that. Now, that's a very wide readership, and it's a very hungry readership. And what we've discovered is, what we've been doing with our journalism is trying to make more of it at a faster pace. We call it live journalism, to be more competitive, to also give readers news as it's happening, especially when it's Ukraine, or recently with Elon Musk and Twitter. The appetite for that story is relentless, and we had a live briefing that just fed into just different aspects of the story, and it just got enormous readership. So we're trying to meet the reader in two ways. One is to give them that comprehensive pull back look, but also when there is breaking news of interest, try to meet them like as the news happens, to be competitive.
And did that shift at all for you during the pandemic? I think you started at the Times just before the pandemic started.
Is
that right?
3 weeks before the pandemic. So for me, it's been largely virtual. I think if anything, the pandemic taught us, and this isn't necessarily about business and finance journalism, but it taught us that our readers really do want live, immediate, up-to-date news, because the thirst for pandemic-related coverage was so enormous, and it was very broad. How does it affect the economy? How does it affect, small business? What's happening to the markets? Why are the markets going up when the entire economy is shaking because we've all kind of, shut down? When can I go out? There's so many. What's going to happen to work from home? Is this a temporary thing? So there were just so many questions, and we tried to meet the reader in every format possible. And I haven't even talked about our audio and visual journalism efforts, because those are also kind of, places of growth for us. But I would say that it just reinforced the notion and our efforts to kind of really meet people real time while also pulling back. It's kind of like a juggling act. And I think we've, learned that our audience appreciates that. So I would say that's definitely been kind of a big takeaway for us emerging out of the pandemic.
That's so interesting. I know that at the start, we've seen sort of surges in interest in COVID, and then really you could see the audience sort of tiring of COVID coverage. And then when the actual waves of COVID return, there's more interest in COVID coverage. We'll see if we ever get out of that cycle. But I wonder if you could talk about how you see the audience for the business coverage that Global does.
And so I've got a bit of a unique perspective in terms of types of audiences. I've served three very different ones throughout the course of the pandemic. So at the onset of the pandemic, I was over at Vice serving a youth media outlet and a really interesting and very specific audience there. And then I moved over to BNN Bloomberg, and it was, more of your savvy investors, niche, but national. And then here at Global News on multiple platforms, it is a big, broad, Main Street audience. And these are people who I'm finding that the appetite for business stories and health, I would say those two, has been voracious throughout the course of the pandemic. And I have felt that whether it relates to, what's going on with the housing market, or stocks, or inequality, whether that's income or racial inequality, injustices, and the rest of it. And so all of that folds into my beat, and it's been this great challenge. I mean, it's never been more exciting to cover inflation, certainly not in recent memory. So yeah, it's been really interesting. And the key thing for us is we try to be where our audience is, and sometimes that involves going onto platforms that you might not necessarily think of. Apparently, some of my longer form pieces live well on Snapchat, for example. And so that is part of the new frontiers. I think business journalism is so valuable, especially for a Main Street audience. It's not the kind of thing that's necessarily taught in schools, whether it's personal finance or what's happening with the economy and what that means for your household budget and your day-to-day. So yeah, I think it's just a very exciting and unique time. I wouldn't want to be anywhere else.
Yeah, it must be interesting to get some take up on a Bank of Canada announcement, and actually some desire to run a story on that.
It's wonderful. And yeah, and I'm finding that, once upon a time, and I've been doing this for some time, I'm going to date myself a little bit, 15 plus years. And there was a time, there are lulls, of course, and sometimes you have to work a little bit harder to sell a certain business story and say, no, this is going to be really interesting, and here's why. There's a bit less of that I'm finding now, in that I bring the story and there's great appetite for it. What have you got? What can you give us? And just, health and business during the pandemic have really kind of risen to the top, in my view.
For sure. Rita, what's your view from the Globe and Mail on who the audience is for the report on business these days?
Oh, well, so traditionally our audience has been, the investor, people who work on Bay Street, people who work in corporate Canada broadly. But that is shifting. So I am a business columnist here at the Globe, and I have a wider story selection or topic selection for my columns. But in addition to that, we are in the process of reimagining our own business coverage. In fact, we've called it ROB Reimagination. And I was one of the members of that steering committee that was in charge of overseeing that process. And so I can tell you some of the things that we're doing differently now is that we have increased our focus on, personal finance. That was always a key aspect of what the Globe had done, but I think there's a recognition that we need to do it for a broader audience segment. And there are 4 key segments that the Globe is really going after. We have the people who are early on in their career. Those are kind of new readers that we need to cultivate. There are people who are in mid-career, such as myself. They have different kind of milestone and planning needs. There are people who are senior in their career who are looking to transition, and planning for retirement. And there are people who are post-career whose financial planning needs are very different. So the people looking at those kind of milestones is one aspect. There is also an increased emphasis on attracting diverse audiences, people of color. Women have traditionally, we need to do better at attracting the female reader and young people. And so one of the things that our editor-in-chief, David Walmsley, has talked a lot about is that he's said to me last week, print isn't necessarily the way we will first attract a younger reader. Perhaps it is through our podcasts, such as the Decibel or Stress Test, which have been tremendously popular with a younger demographic, or perhaps it is these events that we are putting on at the Globe and Mail. It's an alternative way to provide content, just to bring in new readers. So this is something that we're thinking about, much more strategically. I would say the other things that we're really focused on are, digital partnerships with, some of the big tech giants, Apple and Google, but also refining our digital tools and helping people, figure out what they need to know as part of their personal finance journey, and trying to, customize those tools as much as possible, making the digital experience as seamless as possible for readers, so that that it's not clunky, and that we give people kind of new and interesting reasons to stick around.
So we talked a bit about the personal finance aspect when we were preparing for this panel. Obviously, people are facing a lot of financial challenges these days. I think even navigating all of the pandemic benefits and the taxation issues around some of the pandemic benefits was a challenge for a lot of people, something that really needed coverage. Preeta and Anne, I wonder if you could talk about how you both are seeing are approaching personal finance a bit differently. Preeta, maybe we'll start with you.
Sure. Yeah, no, I think in so many ways, just to echo what Rita and Anne were talking about, the pandemic was really a business story, and there was a large personal finance aspect to it, because immediately when something like this happens, you just want to know, well, what's going to happen to my money? Like, and if you are, no matter where, at what stage in your professional life you're in, you are hungry for that information. And as you said, Christine, there was just so much new information to process. What's going to happen, to my student loan, in the US. And I'm speaking specifically about the US, which is where my focus is, of course, whether it's a student loan, whether it's if you're a small business owner, what's going to happen? Am I going to get this money from the government? When do I have to repay it? What are the terms? Just so many. And then the stimulus money that people got, how are you going to get it? I remember in early 2020, we had this thing called the Hub for Help, which was largely just a personal finance thing, just helping people understand. And that thing just went gangbusters. It just had such a consistent engagement and millions of, page views because people were just really hungry for that. Looking toward the future, I do think that as we think about our younger readers, people, Gen Z entering the workforce, they think about money very differently. They tap and use money almost very differently. Sort of digital currencies are the norm, obviously. I think people aren't using checkbooks anymore and haven't been for a while. And so, and financial inclusion and thinking and trying to reach different audiences and different readers who have maybe different cultural notions of money, and people who are more conservative about saving, people who care about where they, thinking about investing, but want to invest only in companies that fit in with their worldview or their goals or ESG. So how do we reach that reader? How do we write stories for those people that people can, because personal finance always ends up having a service aspect to it. So how do you make your stories relevant and usable, but also informative for them? And then we're putting a lot of effort and resources into our cryptocurrency coverage. Now, no one knows what the future of it is going to be. There's still so many questions unanswered, including what on earth is it? But we're trying to get better at kind of, if it's part of people's portfolios and if people have investments in that, we want to get smart about it and write stories for our readers. So I think it's a very dynamic and changing world, and some of the traditional ways in which we've covered personal finance perhaps don't quite hold anymore. So I'm in the middle of a rethink as well, and how do we write these stories? How do we attract newer and younger audiences, and how, again, different formats, not just the traditional story.
Yeah, I really think back to the GameStop frenzy last year. I think that really forced a lot of reconsideration about some of the business coverage. And Anne, I know you've been, excuse me, coughing here. I know you've studied Bitcoin. You've actually been involved in that industry. So I wonder how that influences your own approach to personal finance coverage.
Yeah, so just a little bit of the backstory on that. In 2017, 2018, I took a little time out from journalism, which is all I'd ever known throughout my career, to go work in fintech. I worked for what was at the time one of Toronto, Canada's leading blockchain companies. And I wanted to know, I needed to know what was going on there. And I wanted to be right up close. I didn't want to be so far away from it. I'm working on a book about the wild and wonderful time that I had and all the things that I learned. And I became a C4 certified Bitcoin professional, which just means that I learned about the computer science that powers Bitcoin and also Ethereum. So there is a little bit of expertise there. And then I came back into journalism, and I found that, when I initially left journalism, I was having a tough time selling stories about crypto. And maybe it was a bit too early, but the pushback was, it's too complicated and it's much too niche. And now they're coming to me and asking, what is an NFT and how does this work? And all that. So it's terrific that things have really changed in terms of the zeitgeist and acceptance and editorial decisions related to that as well. This doesn't seem to be treated like a passing fad, but rather something that's here to stay and something that benefits us to learn about as it evolves. But to your point about, how things have changed during the pandemic and the personal finance piece of it, I think that pre-pandemic, for the most part, if you needed, some specific financial advice about debt and savings, and you could do a Google search and find something. Maybe it was a few years dated, but it was fine. Like you could find out what you needed. And then if you remember back to those dark and scary days in 2020, when everyone was stuck at home and no one knew what the heck was going on. I personally thought we were just going to be working from home for 2 weeks, 2 months max. And all of a sudden, those old searches weren't cutting it. You needed new and up-to-date, fresh information for this weird new reality that we were all suddenly trapped in. And I think that has just continued, whether it was, all the confusion around how to apply for CERB, or is it the CERB? Just these new frontiers that we're, coming up to together. And there were so many questions. And I think Google searches are a great way to find out. I mean, I'm not saying you base editorial decisions, all of them, on Google searches, but if you want to find out what people are worried about, what people need to know about right now, that's a great source. And so I think from a business, reporting perspective, that's right there. Those are your cheat sheets, if you will. And they told us that the appetite for all things business, economy, personal finance, what's happening with rates, and all the rest of it, it was right there in those Google Trends.
And Christine, may I jump in? Just you mentioned Reddit, which I know we talked about earlier, and and Anne's mention of Google searches reminded me that Reddit is the other place where we spent a lot of time, me and my team, last year during the retail stock trading mania, GameStop and AMC, and we're still trying to understand how much, whether this is a permanent force in the markets or whether it was something where a lot of people stuck at home during the pandemic just began to look at, buying and selling stocks and where they were going, looking to understand the dynamics of the stock market. Who are the big players? Why, what is short interest? What is a short sale? So, I think Reddit was the other place where, which served as a really good, way for us to understand what were the main issues and concerns and conversations that your, small investors, individuals were thinking about as it, connected to trading and investing.
And the social media piece, I'm just going to jump in here, has become impossible to ignore, in my view. The meme stock frenzy really highlighted that. And I do think that it's something here to stay. It's not just, it may have been kind of the catalyst was that we were stuck at home and had a whole bunch of screen time and not much else. But Reddit has become a place where the Ontario Securities Regulator, the BC Securities Regulator, they're now actively on there, purposefully having conversations and listening to what's going on. You talk to investors on Bay Street and they say, yeah, I now have to do a sweep of Twitter in addition to looking things up on the Bloomberg terminal to find out the kind of real story about what's going on with this specific publicly traded company. So the game has changed. And yes, a big part of it is, retail investors having a bigger voice, and social media is where they're at. But there has this shift, I think, is here to stay, and it really benefits us all to pay attention to it. And what does this mean going forward?
It's so interesting. You all brought up so many interesting points. And I think related to the question of audience, I'd love to talk to you about how the business model of business journalism. I think we're going to solve this problem right here in the next 15 minutes or so. But I know at the Toronto Star, our business team, it's small, there's 5 of us and 2 amazing interns right now, but we meet every week on Zoom just to check in and talk about story ideas. We also look at analytics and look at how stories have done. So we look at subscriptions and engagement and clicks. And, we see some encouraging trends. Some of the stories that we spend more time working on, the features, the investigations, they definitely tend to do better on subscriptions. So we see some some encouraging signs there. And the business stories do well overall, like within the Toronto Star, which is great to see. At the same time, it really feels like the subscription game is sort of a slow burn, and like, is it ever going to be enough? Rita, I'd love to get your thoughts on this. The New York Times is always kind of held up as the example of where subscriptions can work. And I know the Journal has where you came from has a pretty strong subscription model too. I wonder what your thoughts are on the sort of the long-term viability of subscriptions, and also, like, do clicks matter? What about engagement? What are your thoughts on this?
Yeah, I mean, I think subscription is the way we pay for our newsroom, essentially. It's and it has been a key driver of our growth at the Times for the past decade. I think, when we have a new executive editor and he is inheriting a newsroom, plus the entire company now has like close to 10 million subscriptions, and that includes, our purchase of The Athletic. But I think even a decade ago, we were roughly under 1 million subscriptions. So we have, turned our business around. And it's the same at the Journal, where the focus really has been on trying to distinguish your journalism and saying to potential subscribers that, we have journalism worth paying for, so pay us for it. It's been like as simple. And I understand that it's a very, very competitive world. There's a paywall everywhere that you go, because I think the media industry realized that, you couldn't really depend on advertising to drive business. So you do have an industry now where there's a lot of subscription-based reporting. For us, I think in terms of engagement, it's always a balance. I think depending, like, you don't want to write stories that draw the biggest, you don't want to be driven by that notion, right? That you're writing stories that will bring the biggest eyeballs. The ideal is that you write really, really, agenda-setting journalism that by definition will drive the eyeballs. Because, you could have like a story about a puppy that would get like, million page views. And should you write more stories about puppies, or should you also be writing about the corruption going on somewhere else and holding people accountable? So I think those are challenges that, like, we've tried to address by saying that just do the good journalism and people will come for it and people will pay for it. And you should just focus on shaping and writing the best possible story given all the resources you have. No, it's easier said than done, but like, I think that's been, and then what we've done is also built, I think we've become much better across our newsrooms, across at the Journal and the Times, about building the support staff around the content, where you have really smart people who know just how to promote and place the journalism so that it gets the maximum engagement. And I think being able to invest in those parts of our growth have been really, really essential to propping up and sustaining the subscription model. I'm talking about the audience editors, people who really work to optimize headlines and search engine and all of that. So I think that's been kind of that realization, and that investment has been good for both these newsrooms that I've worked at.
Yeah, it's a crucial part. And I don't think that audience teams can be overlooked by any means. There's often not enough resources for audience teams, unfortunately. Rita, what's your view on subscriptions and the business model in general from the ROB these days?
Well, digital subscriptions, of course, are a key component of what it is that we do. My column is always behind the paywall. And I think for most people who work in the Report on Business, most of their stories are behind the paywall. So it's just something that we're used to. And, I do use our proprietary, digital analytics tool, Sophie, to kind of assess which columns are doing well with the online readership. Of course, it doesn't capture the print readership, but it is helpful to know, what topics are converting people, into readers. And as part of that, it's also thinking about the content that we provide. And as a columnist, I'm thinking about kind of different ways to present business topics and kind of bringing into the mainstream certain topics that perhaps we wouldn't have written about in the past. So some really good examples of that came out of the pandemic are, writing about universal childcare as economic policy. Like when women were disproportionately affected by the first wave of the pandemic, they were the ones that lost the vast majority of their jobs. At one point, there was some talk of how women's gains in the workforce had been set back more than 3 decades. The issue of universal childcare and the lack of childcare spaces became not just a women's issue, it became actual economic policy. And some of the bank CEOs, also wrote in their own op-ed pieces about that. Another example of something like that is, sick leave, paid sick leave, something that many of us take for granted. That became, not just a political topic, or a nice to have. I mean, when we talked about migrant workers or the spread of COVID in certain workplaces that, in factories, that was something that was became a real kind of point of societal debate, and a point of corporate social responsibility. Companies talk an awful lot about corporate social responsibility, but this was one of the topics where the rubber meets the road on corporate social responsibility. I would also say, we paid more attention to topics such as executive compensation, the CEO pay ratio compared to the average worker. There were so many essential workers who didn't have the option from working from home. They had to show up. They were the ones facing disproportionate risk. And, while many of them did receive temporary hero pay, a lot of that was scaled back. But we've seen executive compensation, be a real sore point. My colleague David Milstead has been writing columns and news pieces very recently about executive compensation since we're in proxy season. And I'd say the other kind of item that we've been thinking about differently, and the other topic is, okay, obviously we saw, housing, the value of housing just, explode. The prices for homes explode during this pandemic. But at the same time, housing is a human right. Became a very important focus for us as well, because we were telling people, stay home, right? You all have government to say, but what if you don't have a home to go to? Or what if you live in a congregate setting? So rethinking these topics and the way we've presented them in our business coverage, housing is no longer just an asset. Right. This is now an issue of human rights. This is an issue that the pandemic has kind of really highlighted, the issue of unaffordable housing. And I think, it'll continue to be something that we write about, but in a more comprehensive way.
For sure. Anne, how do you see the business model for business journalism within sort of the traditional TV broadcast world that you're working in?
So I don't have a ton to talk in terms of, the model for that. And I try to kind of very carefully stay out of those types of conversations. Though I do want to pick up on something that Rita mentioned in terms of, these problems that we had societally that existed pre-pandemic. And then with COVID-19 and everything that came with it, the restrictions and all the rest of it, it just brought them into the spotlight. Whether it was, how important our homes are and how different home is depending on where you are. All of a sudden homes for some people became their schools, their gyms, their office, sometimes their daycare, which was difficult. I can speak from personal experience with 2 young kids. But also a reminder that for other people, it was much worse than that. Homes were either unsafe, unsuitable. Maybe they didn't have access to great internet. And then what do you do when you need that to connect to work or to school? And to your point about the essential workers, that, we're going into work day in and day out, but we weren't compensating them as though they were essential. And so I could go on and on and on. The lack of safety net for gig workers, they were an afterthought, at least initially, when we started thinking about how are we going to deal with all of this and certain workplaces getting shut down and the future of events being a big old question mark. And so I would just say that the great opportunity that the pandemic has given us in terms of business coverage is some of the topics that maybe weren't in the spotlight before, but were really, really important. They were simmering just below the surface. All of a sudden, we got to dive into them in a big way. And I was doing interviews with people from, all different walks of life. And it was really humbling. I think we're going to look back on this in terms of, moment in time and say, remember, this is how we used to do things before COVID-19 hit. And then we had a gut check, a collective gut check, and we tried things. CERB was a kind of a de facto universal basic income, which was not going to be politically sellable in the same way pre-pandemic. And so we've set precedents. We've decided that certain things are important for certain groups, working parents, but also that it benefits us collectively. So all this to say, it's no shortage of topics to be covered, but I think a lot of them were things that maybe as within the business beat, we were not giving them enough coverage, weren't putting them into the spotlight, certainly the same way that we will now be doing going forward.
Yeah, I guess anyone who thinks that business reporting is boring or not relevant to people's lives, I think the pandemic has shown us that it really couldn't be further from the truth. Something else that we talked a lot about as a society during the pandemic, during the past 2 years, has been diversity and inclusion. And I want to talk about some of the strategies that you see being used to promote more diversity and inclusion in business newsrooms and also in business coverage. Preeta, can you talk about how you see this issue?
Yeah, I think two ways. I'll talk about our coverage and our hiring, two aspects that I'm obviously very closely involved in. I think we are becoming much more systematic about making sure that for every job that we're looking for across the newsroom, right, not just in business and finance, but across the entire newsroom, that we really, really have a thoughtful and wide and extensive search, that we go out of our way, and we do this with intention and methodically to draw up a list of as diverse and inclusive a list of potential candidates, even if they've never really thought of applying for the job that we want, or if they're working in a related field, but we think that they could be a good fit. So I think our process for that search has, I think people have always known and wanted to do that, but we're becoming much more systematic about it, which I think is great progress. And, we work closely with our HR teams, and I think everyone is aware that this is necessary, and now we're kind of implementing a lot of the steps. So I hope that produces at least a broader and more diverse slate of candidates that will help us improve the diversity and inclusiveness of our newsroom. So that's on the hiring end. On the coverage side, it makes me happy to see that my reporters, I think, are very aware of looking at how finance and the actions of the main actors in the world of finance, i.e. Wall Street, how they behave, how they act, how their actions affect different groups of people. And then to hold those institutions accountable, whether we did a story not too long ago about the insurer State Farm and how there were all of these lawsuits alleging that State Farm, behave differently toward people of color. The company's comment is in the story, of course, and it's online. So we that's just a recent example. And also in terms of the people we try to quote, I think my reporters are pretty good about just saying, okay, so we need an expert voice on this. Let me try for a woman. Let me try for not a white male. I mean, there are plenty of those, and it's fine to quote them too. And I think sometimes they're the best. But I think at least if you're trying, and it can be hard under deadline when, you've got only 20 minutes and you need an outside voice, and maybe this is the only person you have. So these steps are small and slow and take time. But I think if you're aware of it, as people increasingly are, and you're trying to be better about who you're quoting, the way you're thinking about stories, over time, you begin to see slow but measurable signs of progress. So that's how I see it for us.
Yeah, and I'd love to pick up on that point, especially because you work in such a visual medium. So when you're featuring people in your reports, it's quite evident whether it's a white man or not. I wonder how you've been approaching that issue in the past few years.
And I will say that I think the process has become easier. And a big part of that is on the part of, the people on the ground collecting the information and then going to the different voices, but also there's buy-in from the gatekeepers, even within our newsroom. There is an understanding. I feel that, if I need more time to get a better story with better and diverse voices, I can push for that. And I feel like there is an appetite for that kind of thing. I will also say, just from a kind of news you can use perspective, diverse sources beget diverse sources. So if you find someone who's terrific and, you stay in touch with them, but also you can ask them about their own networks. And for me personally, it has enriched my reporting in ways that I can't even begin to describe. My virtual Rolodex is much bigger, but it's also more precise and exact, and it has yielded this kind of symphony of people that existed before, but now I know about them and can bring them and share them on a national platform. And just really quickly as well, I wanted to talk a little bit about reaching those diverse audiences. And I mentioned being on Snapchat as one way, and it's a big week for me. So I'm just going to talk about just a few projects as well that are launching this week. So I have a podcast. It's called The Peak. The first episode is going to be rolling out on Friday. And I think that's going to be a really important way for us to reach, a younger audience that is interested in business stories, but is also hungry for some analysis. Why are these the top stories? What does that mean to me? And there's room as well for some personality, some hot takes. And I think that that's really important in terms of, keeping those stories fresh in people's minds and helping them to understand them, because business stories can be tremendously complicated. And when you kind of distill them into their essence, and then you can kind of play around with it a little bit to the point of, we don't necessarily want to, write about kittens and puppies all the time, though they do very well and there's great engagement. But maybe there's a way to take some of the things that are trending in pop culture and say, you know what, there's a direct line between this and this top business story, and here's the deal. In addition to that, so the podcast is, sub 10 minutes. I'm doing my inaugural current affairs piece on Global News's show, The New Reality, and it airs on Saturday. And it's all about the war for talent and the incredible shifts that are happening in terms of who holds the power in the job market. And it's very much a job seekers market in a way that some recruiters have said they have not seen in their lifetime. So this kind of expanding and contracting of business stories, and this expansion of what is a business story and what platform it can live on, and the types of voices that we use to tell these stories. I think that's a big piece of the diversity puzzle.
Absolutely. I am probably going to go look up some cat videos after this, but you have to have a balanced media diet, I think. When I've found that also in terms of finding diverse sources, that actually having written some stories about diversity in various aspects of business, various industries, has helped me find sources who I then try to turn to as experts when I'm writing about issues that are not specifically about diversity. Rita, any tips and tricks on this point?
So, I mean, echoing both of what Anupreeta and Anna said, we're looking at hiring differently. We're looking at content differently. But I guess the thing that I wanted to say and speak directly to anyone who is a journalism student right now, who's considering, a career, in business journalism, please consider it. Business journalism is where it's at. Forget political reporting. That's just boring. I'm being really serious when I say I know I'm very unpopular for saying that, but listen, the real power brokers in the country are in the business community, and we need diverse voices. We need diverse writers. And the thing that I wanted to emphasize is that, being an outsider actually does give you an advantage. I'm an outsider. This is, I write about a community that is not the one that I grew up in. These are not people I roll with on the weekends. These are my friends. And so that actually gives you an opportunity to be fiercely independent. You're not trying to seek people's approval. You're writing in the public interest. And you can do that, but you can actually champion the public interest because you're not seeking that approval. You're not, writing about your friends. You're not worried that you're going to offend your dad's, bestie on the golf course. I think that I would encourage everyone to think very long and hard about the difference between and the opportunity that we have, distinguishing access journalism from accountability journalism. And I think accountability journalism is what really matters. It's about, holding companies accountable and acting as a check, when they, make claims, when they mislead their investors, or if there's corporate malfeasance, if there's money laundering, corruption. I mean, there's not every story is a negative story, of course, but there is an aspect of accountability journalism that is there that should be very appealing to younger people. You can do it differently, and this will be the best time intellectually you'll ever have in your career because you're constantly learning on the job. So this is my personal appeal to anyone who's watching, who's interested in the career. Come talk to any of us. As you can see from this panel alone, the future of business journalism is female and very exciting. So, approach any one of us and be happy to talk to you about it. And I just wanted to say one more thing that I learned from Christine, because I do a reported column. When she and I worked together at the Globe, she used to, call up companies and she'd ask for interviews with people and she'd say, isn't there a woman I could speak to? Isn't there a visible minority I can speak to? That was her approach. And I thought that was brilliant. It was brilliant. And something that I have adopted in my own practice as a columnist, because I do write a reported column. I've done the exact same thing. So, thank you, Christine.
Yeah, it was an interesting thing, or sort of experiment, especially when I was on a beat where I was covering the same companies over and over and trying to get some different voices into stories, but really just wanting them to think about it and hopefully present people as sources on an organic basis, not just because this person is a woman or a visible minority. Anyways, I think it's a work in progress for us all, as I'm sure we would all agree. I'd like to move to some questions that we've gotten. Some of the topics we've actually covered in what we've already talked about. But one question from Eugene E is, how is climate change influencing business coverage? Obviously a huge topic today. I think, Rita, you're involved in a panel on sustainable investing later today. Rita, I wonder if you could weigh in on what you see on this front.
Yeah, I think, we have a climate desk now, and we've had for a while. So people who are very specifically focused on writing about the climate in as many ways as possible. But, I think the question is really rooted in the bigger point that Rita was making about business journalism being at the heart of so many things, right? It's about money, it's about policy, it's about power, it's about how decisions get made, it's about why a company can choose or not to choose to do something, right? Like, it's about whether an investor is pushing a company for more disclosure. It's about geopolitics, driving short-term interests versus what we all know is good for the climate in the long term. We didn't expect a war to change to force people to revisit, say, Biden's, climate plan. So all of that is very much part of business journalism coverage. It's an expansive view, but I think it's the right view because money and business is at the center of a lot of these decisions. I mean, for us, I think climate is something that we're reacting to, following the story, trying to understand how seriously businesses are taking it, reporting on their efforts, holding them to account when we see flagrant violations of their stated interests in an environment where there isn't very clear regulatory policy or guidance yet. How do you hold someone to account? I think that is a challenge for all climate reporting at the moment because governments everywhere are also stuck in how strict you can be, right? And the kind of preoccupations of electoral politics often interfere. And the idea of the fact that we have national boundaries also interfere with how you think about covering and writing and doing justice to a topic that is so global and so long-term. So I think these are challenges that we think about and are trying to, again, get more systematic about covering climate in itself, but also through business, through policy, through money, through holding companies to account, through following investors and what they're really looking for. And the fact that a lot of companies, I think, largely probably pay lip service to the notion of ESG and that they need to be pushed and prodded to do more. And who's doing that? Journalism is only one piece of it. So, following all of these different threads, I think is something that we're very aware of and doing more and more of.
The disclosures around climate and ESG are so varied and frustrating. It sort of reminds me of diversity issues where we don't even have the base info to be able to sort of gauge whether progress is being made. And you're kind of in the situation where you're having to take a company or an organization at their word. It's extremely frustrating. And how do you see climate coverage in your reporting?
I think the view of kind of where it fits in with business journalism has changed in that it's impossible to ignore certainly from a risk perspective, whether you're an insurance company or insert any kind of business here. And I think that we're probably, in terms of moments in time, there is corporate buy-in in terms of it is important from a PR perspective. Is there the action to kind of really show that commitment? I don't know that we're there yet, but maybe we're close is what I would say, just in a nutshell.
Got it. And Rita, I know this is probably on your mind since you're going into another panel around this topic later today, but how are you seeing this issue?
Well, the issue of the green transition is one of the kind of core topics that kind of factored into our reimagination of our business coverage. And so, there's different ways to cover that. Obviously, what is it going to mean for traditional, oil producing provinces such as Alberta is one. What is it going to mean for the Canadian banks, which have traditionally been big lenders to the oil patch? There is transition risk for these banks. If you suddenly force a change to happen too quickly. So how are the banks managing that from a regulatory perspective? What does this mean for retail investors? This is something that I'm very interested in. This is becoming more mainstream, environmentally focused investing. But what is the risk that comes with a lot of these investments? Have we looked at that? Is there enough disclosure about risk? Because a lot of these investments are new. A lot of these funds are new. They don't have a performance history. Do retail investors who genuinely want to do the right thing, do they have the appropriate tools to gauge the amount of risk that they might be exposing themselves to with their personal portfolios? I think that's something that we can really examine. Our cover story last Saturday actually happened to be on this issue of environmental and climate-friendly investing. As you mentioned, the Globe is holding a virtual event today that focuses on sustainable finance, and I'm part of that. This is a huge topic, and one that I think, again, there's a lot of accountability and an opportunity for business journalists to really dive in, really act as a check on which companies are living up to their words and which ones are just offering, the kind of the PR, the greenwashing. Yeah. And I think this is so important. So I'm really happy that we actually have a dedicated beat reporter who looks at green investing. But of course, this is not just something for one reporter. It's something that our columnists are covering. It's something that, that we're looking at across our newsroom.
Yeah, it sort of crosses every beat at this point, doesn't it? Here's an interesting question from Petra KM. Will we start to see a shift in narratives about entrepreneurship towards a bigger focus on micro and small, medium-sized enterprise entrepreneurship by and for the people versus billionaire and venture capital shenanigans? I think we can think of one billionaire engaging in some shenanigans right now. And do you want to tackle this one?
Are you perhaps talking about the richest man in history? And, yeah, there are times when, it's difficult to ignore, because he has this tremendous ability to grab headlines and to do things that are intrinsically newsworthy. That shift that you talked about, I think it has begun. I think, like many things, the pandemic has accelerated that. The corporate shenanigans and the kind of 1%ers and how they roll compared with, middle class and lower income, precariously employed people, what different realities and universes we inhabit. So yeah, I think that has begun. There's a great appetite for that type of thing. And yeah, maybe there wasn't enough of that scrutiny pre-pandemic, but certainly there's an awareness of it now, and no hesitation in terms of the accountability piece, and really, I don't want to say going for the jugular, that sounds so aggressive, but not feeling the need to play nice. These are very sophisticated investors, and you can really hold their feet to the fire. I think certainly in our newsroom, that is the feeling.
Rita, I think the Times had a whole magazine issue on billionaires a couple of weeks ago. Yeah. How are you seeing this?
I honestly, I read most of these articles, and I've written about wealth in the past. I think we need to hold power to account. I think we need to establish that there is enormous wealth, most of it hard to estimate, most of it just essentially guesses. There is the industry of catering to billionaires. But if we don't explain that in our societies, there's been this widening income and wealth inequality that's worsening, and that it is systemic. And, I don't think anyone is writing about billionaires to say, oh my goodness, look at these amazing lives they lead. If they are, I think it is in the context of, look at what's going on, like real wages for a lot of people. This present moment, yes, it's a workers' market, but real wages for people have really not gone up at anywhere near the rate that billionaire wealth has. When you look at the Russian oligarchs and the fact that so many of them have massive investments, people fixate on the yachts, but they have many more billions of dollars tucked away in US markets, held through multiple shell companies. I think all of that needs to be part of our general knowledge base, because otherwise we might be under the illusion that things are okay. Okay, life is this way, and they're rich people. But what does it mean to be rich? 1 million and 1 billion are very different. And the fact that billionaire wealth grew so massively during the pandemic. I think in the context of inequality, I think it's really important to focus on that part of our, global economy. In terms of covering stories of individuals, I think are always, and the Times really does look for stories of individuals. For instance, when you look at the Amazon unionization story, the fact that it was, individual action that led to it. We did a big profile a few years earlier, and we, followed it up with writing about the guy who had started it. So those are stories about individual success, maybe not entrepreneurship, but, I think we cover both ends of it. But I really don't think that we should take our attention off the billionaire class.
Can I just jump in for a second, Christine?
Yeah, Rita.
I think that entrepreneurship is something that we really do need to focus on because these small businesses took the a real brunt of the economic shutdowns, and there is a real concern that the entrepreneurial spirit has been damaged. Particularly if you are a woman or if you are a visible minority, who was already facing barriers to obtaining financing. I think this is an area where we really need to focus on going forward as we continue with the recovery to ensure that the recovery in entrepreneurship and in the small business sector is an equitable one. And it's actually a topic that I have just filed a draft on for the Report on Business magazine. It's specifically about barriers facing Black entrepreneurs. So, I think this is something, a real opportunity for us going forward to kind of, even with entrepreneurship and small businesses to kind of rethink who we're writing for.
Well, as expected, this hour went extremely quickly. And unfortunately, there's other questions that we weren't able to get to, but we did cover some of the themes that were raised in the questions during our earlier conversation. So I just wanted to thank you all, and Anupreeta and Rita. We've really learned a lot from this discussion. Like I said, we could keep talking for probably an hour or two longer. I wanted to thank everybody who joined us and those who submitted questions. And to stay up to date on CJF events, you can sign up for the newsletter or follow the Canadian Journalism Foundation on social media. So thank you everybody for watching, and enjoy the rest of your day.